Hey there, welcome to the Emotional Revolution podcast. I'm Kayla Birch, and I'm here to help you break free from those emotional patterns that keep holding you back so you can step into alignment, reclaim your confidence, and create the life and business you've been dreaming of. So let's get started and begin your journey to emotional freedom. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Emotional Revolution podcast. Today is going to be such a powerful conversation. I cannot wait to share it with you. I have Ashley Ann, who is a creative alchemist and book strategist, and she helps aspiring authors turn their life experiences into powerful tools for transformation. So Ashley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to see where our conversation takes us today.
Yes, I think it's going to be so powerful. So you already, just by introducing you, I can see so much that has to do with story. So I'm just interested in your story. Like, what got you to this place? Like, why this? Why are you a book strategist? Why do you help people create their stories? What led you here?
And you know what? It's the intention too behind your podcast has such a big part in the journey as well. And I'm just going to paint a super quick backstory in the sense that I was never this type of person that enjoyed being in conversation, even just kind of like one-on-one doing a podcast or speaking or anything like that. I was terrified. Having to do like any sort of like presentation in school, I was mortified. I would turn bright red. I would be sweating. It was so uncomfortable for me. And I realized that a lot of that stemmed from simply just, not being able to speak up for myself, not being so afraid to use my voice to speak my truth, and just really holding back a lot of emotions. And that really just stemmed a lot from like my relationship with my father. And so that was such a pivotal moment for us to be able to heal our relationship and actually be able to allow myself to go through literally all the emotions of like grief and anger and bitterness to land in a spot of this sounds kind of cheesy, but like to land in a spot of being able to love again, specifically him, and bring love back into our relationship. And that was such a pivotal moment for me in my life to be able to have this very raw conversation together and also just be able to forgive him and be able to just move on. And it was like in that moment, I mean, like almost not instantly, but it was like I was already given these opportunities to start public speaking. And then after this experience, it was like floodgates kind of open, and I was putting myself in public speaking competitions, even though I was still scared. But it was like part of me was just like, you got to do this. And the moment that I stepped on that first stage, it was like a homecoming. And it was like, wow, you have so much power in your voice and in your story. And then it was just kind of like this catalyst where one thing led to another, more speaking engagements, writing my own book. And it was all inspired from, all the healing that happened. And through that, my relationship with my dad, of course, navigating other different things, but it was such a pivotal moment for me. And when I was able to move through all of that, that's kind of what led me here. And the thing is, funny enough, like it was never really about me and my book. It was kind of like that stepping stone in the journey to just figure out how to do this thing of like writing a book and getting your story out there to then support other people on their path and in their journey, and who ultimately want to share their story too. But, we all have blocks that kind of get in our way when we want to do something. And that, that has become my focal point, as like, be the person that removes those blocks for people, those boulders, the resistance, because our stories have so much power in it, not just for ourselves, but for the people that we want to impact.
Yes, I am like, oh my gosh, so much good stuff there. And I think that what really stood out to me in that journey is, it's that pivotal moment where it's like, okay, I have to step into something different. What I find a lot working with people, and especially at the beginning, is that there's a lot of honesty and responsibility that we have to take to be able to step into those conversations. So a lot of people stay stuck in blame and shame and just resistance. And so they don't write their book. They don't step on the stage. They don't move to that level that they're wanting because they've identified themselves with, oh, this is how it always is. I'm the person that can't speak up. I'm the person that turns red. I'm the person that doesn't have those skills. So we identify all of that, and then we blame others. So what was that like for you? Why did you shift out of, I'm not saying you were blaming, right? But
Mhm.
typically we're blaming in some way or
Oh,
another
totally.
until we're not. And so what actually was that thing where the mirror was so strong that you said, I have to address this?
Mm. And yeah, so a big thing that kind of sparked a lot of like what was almost like, my relationship with my father growing up was just very distant, and then I was in a car accident, and then it just like revealed just so many like more things to me, and it didn't sit right with me. And to be honest, like the following year, that entire year following the accident, I became very bitter, like almost unrecognizable. And I remember this one moment where I was having dinner with my mom and my stepdad, and I don't know what I said. It was just probably something very nasty and hateful, because that was just like the space that I was in. And she said to me, she goes, Ashley, you don't have to hate the world. And it was like this like light bulb moment of just my mom holding up this mirror. And it was like, Ashley, who have you become? This is not who I am. I'm not this person who, I'm just not this like bitter, angry person. And it just got to this point, like that was like the moment of like, enough is enough. Like, I don't want to be this person anymore. And I think I was already starting to get into like personal development and personal growth. So it was kind of just like things were all creating this puzzle all together. And it was like, this is it. Like, you can no longer be this person. And once you have this, I'm such a believer that once you have the awareness of something, you've got one or two choices. Like, you either stay doing the same thing that you've been doing, or you've got to change. And that was like the only choice for me, was just making that change. And it came down to like just having the hard conversation and kind of stepping up and being that, because realistically, if I wanted anything to change, I had to be that person. And sometimes
Mhm.
that's hard too, especially when we're in a way, sometimes we feel like we're teaching our parents. But I just knew it was something that I had to do. Like, there was just no ifs, ands, or buts anymore.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about that too is that when I see this so much, and like it's such a relevant thing with like teaching our parents, and what happens a lot when people go to like confront somebody, a loved one in their life, typically, usually somebody from their
Yeah.
childhood and into their adulthood, and it becomes that blame. It becomes, I'm this way because you did this or you didn't do
Mm-hmm.
that, or all of these different things, and then the other person becomes super defensive. And so I'm just curious, and you can share as much or as little as you want about this, but I think that especially with parenting, that's a huge barrier, because the parent just wants to do their very best. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes their very best is just their very best. And we have our own perspectives. Like, we have our own experience of our life. And it doesn't mean, it really doesn't have anything to do with our parent. It has to do everything with our experience in our
Mm-hmm.
life and our reality and how we perceive our reality. And so, how did you address that? Like, how was that open conversation? Because I know a lot of people listening here have somebody that they need to have a real, honest, hard conversation with. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to kind of share your experience in a way that would mirror how somebody else could maybe step into that, what would that look like?
Yeah. So, as someone who's, I mean, written a book and also just loves reading and whatnot, you can imagine that my outlet was writing. And so I actually wrote him a letter, and I allowed myself to just be truly honest. And to be honest, I reflecting back in hindsight, right? I see and I'm like, I probably could have like taken that first draft and like rewrote it, because it just felt still like it was kind of just like venting and coming from a place of blame. But it was what it was. But that
Mhm.
is what opened the door to us to be able to have this conversation. I put it all in a letter, I gave it to him, and then we ended up having a conversation in person. And to be honest, I had no recollection of even what we had, like what was said face to face, because in that moment, I was ready. I was already in the space of like, I've forgiven you. I've forgiven myself, because that was also a big part of it. Like, I had to forgive myself for blaming myself and just becoming that victim and just seeing things from this victim mindset, because that is a big part of it, right? Like, our perception is something that really impacts us. And I just recently started a course in miracles, and this is literally like first time I've been doing this. I've heard so much about it. one of my best friends and I, we've been kind of chatting about it over the holidays. And oh my gosh, it's very confronting. It's very confronting because I'm also just like in a space as well. Again, like when we have these relationships, we're always going to have these moments, right? And just confronting in the sense of like how ultimately at the end of the day, it's how I make everything mean. And that is such a very difficult thing for our ego to
Mhm.
understand, comprehend, and also just be able to like shift that perspective. So, yeah, it's just interesting. But for me, it was like I got it all down on a piece of paper, wrote it out, and it was like almost it just came out already, and I feel like we have to find our ways that we can filter through that, through all the emotions that we're experiencing. So whether it be like just throwing up a journal, this way you can actually come to the conversation with more of a clear head. And I think that's what, or I don't want to say clear head, but almost like a clear heart, because at the end of the day, our
Mhm.
emotions are creating just like so much buildup in our body. And sometimes I feel like when we're in that very high emotional state, we say things we don't mean, and things aren't just, we can't necessarily comprehend everything that is even just being communicated to us. So I feel like that was my way of filtering through all of that, getting it out of my system, and then being able to come to the conversation with like just this like completely open heart.
Yeah, that's so amazing. And how did you do that? Like, how did you go to the conversation with a clear heart? Because you said that you needed to forgive yourself. So a lot of people have a hard time in that aspect. Like, if we're being really honest, like we don't like to
Yeah.
step into responsibility for what we were doing in our life or the responsibility we have for where we're at. So what was that like for you? How did you take that responsibility and begin to
Mm.
forgive yourself?
Such a good question. What comes to mind right first and foremost is that I wasn't taking responsibility for the things that he had done, because facts are just facts. Like that was it. At the end of the day, I wasn't taking responsibility for that. I was taking my responsibility for how I reacted to things, some of the things that I said. Like that's what I can control. That's where I was in the wrong, regardless of what has happened to me. How we react to anything, how we respond, that's on us. That's where we have the opportunity to take responsibility. And so of course it's going to be a little confronting, but at the end of the day, I had to do that. I really had to look at like, wow, I've been playing the victim for so long of just like, and it's created even more of a separation from the thing that I deeply desire, right? Like I desire this relationship with my father. I desire to have him in my life, but because I'm staying in this like complete loop of just like, well, he did this to me and this and this and this, I'm not getting what I desire. So I think that's really important, is to, at least for the starting point, is really taking responsibility for things that you've said, how you've reacted, how you've been maybe living, and the things that are just not serving you. And it's not, I think the underlying piece too is not to shame yourself and not to guilt yourself. And I know that might be difficult and hard, but um, we're also only doing the best that we can, and we learn. And as long as you are learning from things, then you can make that shift. Like I said, awareness is everything. You can do better the next time. It's not that it's kind of gone out the window. You can do better the next time. We're human, right? We're human. So just that piece around compassion for ourselves, and ultimately I think that shows that we can have compassion too for our parents, because like you said, right, they're doing the best that they can too with what they know and
That's what
through
they
their
know.
own
Mhm.
lens and through
Yes.
their experience.
Yes. And so everyone's always doing that the best they can. Even if we look at it from our perspective and we're like, that's the best you can do. Like that was it.
I know.
But it's like, that's it. Like people are only doing the best that they can, always with what they have, with where they're at. And I think that's a beautiful representation. And it really kind of sums up the body of work I do. So I have a method called the trigger response method. So it takes you
Mm.
from the trigger, the reaction that you have within you, all the way to your response. And everything that we're talking about right here is what is made up in that method. Because if we don't do that, and we stay stuck in those reactive cycles. And so the personal responsibility, the honesty, all of that, the letting go, the understanding what we gain from it, from staying in those cycles of whatever pattern we're stepping into,
Yeah.
right? Whatever that looks like. And I love that you really made it clear that you weren't taking responsibility for what your father did or didn't do, right?
Mhm.
That's what we have to do because things happen to us. We are at times a victim to circumstance or somebody else's hand or behavior, but we don't have to remain that. That doesn't have to become our identity, right? We have a sense of control. Things do happen to us, but we have that control of how we step into it and through it. And that's where people get hung up. And then that's where
Yeah.
they don't like to step into what we're talking about here is because they're like, no, this person did something to me. And it could have been a really bad thing that they did to them. I'm like, we're not dismissing that. I'm not dismissing that something really horrible happened to you. We're talking about what you can do now with it in your life. So
Mm.
after you worked in all of these different areas and you dug really deep, what did that transform for you in the external world, right? So you worked on your
Mm.
internal world. How did that impact how things were happening in the external?
Yeah, so I think two things really stand out for me and how it really impacted me that moment was I recognized the kind of like I guess more on a spiritual lens. I think I recognized the depths in which I can love and the power of love. I know, again, I don't want to sound cheesy or cliche, but I think that's what showed me through that experience, through forgiving something where I think, honestly, even most, like a lot of people around me were kind of like, yeah, but you can still kind of like hold him accountable for what he did. And my belief was really like, if I'm letting this go and if I'm like starting clean slate, like we're going to move on. I'm not going to bring up the past, when something happens again, because we're human, right? Like things are not going to be perfect. He's lived, the amount of years that he's lived doing the things that he's done. Not to say that he can't change, but we're a creature of habit, right? So that was a big thing for me. It's just like recognizing, like, wow, if I can love this person who created so much harm, I can do that to anyone in my life. I can bring that everywhere with me. And it kind of actually looked like that. Like going through that process, I then was doing that with like past relationships and just like clearing it and just being like,
Mhm.
I don't have to be stuck in these like emotions. I don't have to like carry these with me anymore. So that was kind of like one way. But the other way was because that was the moment, that conversation with my dad felt like that very first time I was actually able to use my voice and communicate, which is wild to even think about because I was probably like 19 or 20-ish, like in and around that time frame. So finally being able to communicate unleashed, it was like it completely unleashed me. Like, again, everything's in hindsight, but I truly believe that that had to happen in order for me to step into all of who I was meant to be, the person who is a storyteller, the person who does have something to say, the person who can help others get that out of them as well. It literally like cleared my throat chakra. Like it was so blocked. I would get so many sore throats all the time. And after that, it was like, oh my God, I'm floodgates. Hello, let's go. And so I was speaking, and then the book came out like a few years after that whole conversation and stuff with my dad. I released my book, I wrote my book, released it, and it was just kind of like, let's go, like we are here, and we've kind of like literally gotten rid of that like boulder, the resistance that's showing up, and it was just allowing me to like be fully myself and to just authentically communicate and be self-expressed.
Yeah. Did you find that those habits, those conditioned responses, continue to show up in some ways? It's not, I like to say, let me take a step back. I like to say that with awareness, the edges dissolve, right? So the edges
Mm,
dissolve. It's not as harsh. And so then eventually it just dissolves completely with awareness and action and changing
yeah.
the habits and changing the behaviors. And so did you find that some of those habits or responses or even thoughts or beliefs came up in the process of building your business and writing your book and being on
Mm,
stage?
yeah. I could see in which the ways that it definitely came up, and there was like moments of kind of like, oh, and you're kind of, I think when we get to other levels, because I wasn't necessarily in that moment or in those first few years. I would say maybe in the last like 5 years that I've seen those things come up again, and you see how it's impacting you. But I also saw them, still coming up even in my own relationship, and just recognizing where I would shut down and where I would not communicate. And so I think that's kind of going to be something that I'm always working at. And yet it's like the response time, or the time that I spent like not using my voice, that has changed, where I'm kind of catching myself. I'm like, you're not speaking up. You're not saying the thing. Like, just say the thing. And so, yeah, I feel like it's kind of coming into this like next evolution of version of myself. You see the patterns like come up, and it's like this beautiful opportunity to again recognize them and get quicker and quicker, kind of like rewiring them in the moment. I feel like has been really powerful too, and to witness myself doing that. So I think
Yeah.
sometimes you get so caught up in it, but then when you recognize, there's the pattern. All right, let's shift this right now in this moment, and let's like change this. And you do it, and you're like, I feel so much better.
Yes.
It like carries less weight over us.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think I think that's such a huge insight. And the reason why I asked that question is because so many people think that like once we've moved past something, once we use our voice, once we address the
Yeah.
situation, once we don't actually believe that belief anymore and that story shifted, that it just goes away. And it's like, it was already created. It's already present. It's not going anywhere. It's
Mm-hmm.
just not going to be as sticky. It's just no longer
Mm-hmm.
your identity, or it's not your operating system anymore. So I have like a story that relates to this so strongly, because like my whole life I never thought I was good enough. I tell a story all the time in one way or another. I never thought I was good enough, smart enough, capable enough, until I worked on obviously my own emotional journey, and I realized none of that was true. I detached from that story, but that story still arises. So a month or so ago, going through this process with my coaching certification course that I have, I was getting it accredited. And then I had to get myself accredited through the process as well. And they sent me an email back, and they're like, it's a very intense process. And I was like, immediately the thought was, oh, they're going to find out that you're not good, that you're not as good as you say you are. And then I just started laughing, and I thought, how funny that thought came up. I have no emotional attachment to it. It doesn't mean anything about me. And, 3 years ago, I would have had that thought. I would have panicked, and I would have been like, oh my God, they really are going to find out that I'm not good. And then I would have
Yeah.
spiraled into the story of that belief, because it was my operating system. And that's what a lot of people get stuck on, is because they're like, no, that thought comes up. It's like, yeah, because you've created that thought in the past, it's going to arise in different aspects. It's your attachment to it. It's your belief
Yeah.
into it. And it's your identity formed around it. So what was that? What do you think the identity that you needed to change, what was that?
Mm. Yeah, I relate so much. I feel like for me, like it was, I always felt like I had to prove myself. That was a big thing for me. And again, like I didn't realize that. Um, that wasn't something that I recognized after, creating this beautiful, like new relationship with my dad, and like writing the book, doing the speaking. I didn't realize that subconsciously I was still in this space of like, do all the things. And again, you'll prove to him, it was all stemming, a lot of it from my dad. You'll prove to him that like you're good enough and you're worthy, and like show him all the, in a way, all the things that he missed. And I didn't realize that until, I would say, a few years ago. I remember just being on a walk, and I was like, why do I feel like I need to prove myself? Because it was showing up. And I was like, why do I feel like I need to prove myself? Because, I would get very triggered when people would call me cute, because it just felt like I'm trying to like identify myself as a speaker and an author. Like those words, cute is not associated with like a professional woman. Like what? So it was a trigger. And so as I started to look at this, I'm like, what's going on here? Like what's underneath this? And so I was on a walk one day, and I was like, oh my God, I feel like I need to prove myself. So that was a big part of my like identity, was just feeling like I have to prove, I have to do this in order to prove that. And I'm not going to say that I'm in this like perfect spot right now, but over the last couple of years has just been this like just this space, literally, kind of like not necessarily fully taking a step back from my business, but just having space to be able to. I mean, things going on personally, like getting married and all that stuff. So that took, just my focus and whatnot. But yeah, I just had this space to be able to go inward. And through all this time I've spent inward, there's just been like a different kind of like confidence and like conviction that I've built um, for what I'm here to do. And that was also a big piece over the last couple of years is kind of like, well, what am I really here to do? And like what truly just comes from a place of love? Because I feel like if I'm coming from this place of like true love for what I do, true like service, because that's where I started. And then it was like, I think when you start getting like, okay, numbers and you got to start like, okay, you got to run a business. Like you can't just keep helping people and not charge. Like you start bringing all these things. You're like, I think it's not easy. I don't want to say easy, but it's not uncommon to kind of lose your way on the whole service side of things, I feel like. But I feel like we have to constantly come back to that place of like, why did you start this in the first place? Like, what is this for you? And so that's what the last like 2 years have given me. And I feel like I'm just like in this different space of not necessarily feeling like do this to prove this. It's like, this is what I want to create. And this comes from a very different place of creating this. It's not like, what do I think the market needs and what do I think is going to sell and make me a lot of money? It's like, ooh, this feels really good to create.
Yeah. Yes, yes, yes. And it's such a valuable thing. And so I like to discern between the two different types of victimhood that we have. And the first victimhood is that we are the victim to our external circumstances and somebody comes and saves us. So we have that version of being a victim and we're always waiting for everyone else to save us. And it's always everyone else's job. I don't relate to that. I relate to the other victimhood of the overcomer. So I'm the victim. So then I can overcome. So I can prove my worth to others. So I was always the victim to my circumstances. And that kind of sounds a lot more familiar with your story too. Like I'm the victim to my circumstances, whether we think that or not. It's like, but I'm going to overcome them. I'm going to prove that I can. I'm going to prove that I'm the best. I'm going to prove that I'm capable. And
I've
so
never heard anyone make that distinction. So I love that.
It's because it's such a powerful distinction because people don't like the word victim because they're like, no, I do things, I overcome. And I'm like, yeah, because you're the victim. So you're always creating circumstances in your life to overcome. And so it's a really huge distinction when we're doing this. And it matches up so much. And I see this so often with entrepreneurs and they come at it from this visceral, I'm going to prove my worth. And in my mastermind, just a couple of days ago, I had asked my students like where they were at on this scale of like living into their own self. And some of them were like fives, like three on a scale from 1 to 5, 3s to 5s. And I said, well, those that are a 5, how much are you trying to prove to others that you're capable? And everyone was like, oh shit. They're like, and I'm like, if you're trying to prove to anyone else that you're capable and you're able, then you're not operating out of doing things for yourself. You're doing it out of proving yourself. You're still making choices and actions because of somebody else's expectations of you. And so you can be seen a certain way instead of just stepping into your life as you, fully as you, and not trying to prove yourself to anyone else, right? Victim to overcomer. So that's such a powerful thing. And I think a lot of people are going to be able to relate to that, your story of like, oh, and then I have to check myself too, like, cause it's my default of being the overcomer. Like I can do it, like I've got 4 kids, I've got all these different things going on, but I am running a successful business. I can do it. And so there's so many different aspects to it that we have to look through. And so for you, how did that translate with your business? Like, you talked about like it being a little difficult to kind of stay on the mission and lean into that and not just always lean into the financial side, which is also a really important side. We're not going to dismiss that, right? We do want to get paid for our services and we want to teach people to do that as well. That's kind of like the whole point, right? To live your purpose and get paid well for it. Yeah. And so what was that like for you? How did you kind of work through that and find that balance between staying you, but not leaning into maybe industry standards or industry expectations?
Well, first and foremost, I gotta say, your distinction has made me like, I'm like, oh my gosh, Ashley, I think I just like unlocked this like puzzle piece to to a lot right now in this moment, of just like how you kind of like how I make things so hard. So it's just very interesting that that
Oh, I'm
is
so glad you
literally
had that
coming up.
opening.
Yep, we're gonna unpack that more. So hello, we're gonna leave that on pause. Um, but I would say, I think one of the biggest things for me, and I've learned this truly over the last couple of years, was I was so prone to kind of like, again, not realizing that I was literally giving up my power, but almost like always searching for things outside of myself, searching for answers outside of myself. And what I've realized just recently is like that is a form of us giving up our power. When we are constantly looking to the next shiny object, we hear about the shiny object syndrome. You're kind of like investing into this program and this program and this program. Even when you kind of seek to, even in your personal relationships, even when you seek to go to whatever, your partner, a best friend, a sister, a parent, and you seek to them for the guidance and the support, like in a way, although we're doing it from like good intentions, we're giving up our power because that's saying that, well, I don't know the guidance that I need. I don't know what I need right now. But I'm a firm believer, especially because of this last year, that we have the answers that we need. It's just we're not getting them. Like we need to get them so quick and in the moment. And when we're not getting them in the moment, we're like frantic and we're kind of like, I need this answer. I need to figure this out right now. But I very like intentionally, not that I haven't invested, but I've been very mindful of who I invest in, what spaces I enter. And so for me, it's been a very intentional journey of go inward. Something comes up, ask inward. Something I remember like viscerally, I had created something and I was like, what is this? Like, I had no idea why I had created this. I was like, that moment where like something just comes through you and it's this like beautiful download and you're like, oh my God, this is so good. I had no idea what it was. I'm like, is this a framework for my next book? Is this like, what is this? And I was like, all right, show me what this is. Right. Like for me, it was just creating this connection between higher self, my guides. And I'm like, all right, show me what this is. And I just like closed the laptop and lo and behold, like I think a week later, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what this is. And so I think like that has been such a big piece for me is just to constantly come back inward. And again, I think that's added to this like piece of like almost like empowerment or even just I think confidence is just like I know I can solve everything that comes up. And I don't necessarily have to seek outward. And not that I'm not necessarily going to, but it's really powerful when you can look inward and pose the question to yourself and be able to come to the understanding or the solution, whatever that looks like. It's very empowering when you do that on your own. Again, it's not to take away from like the support that we need, especially from like mentors. It's just like, how can we, even as mentors, how can we shine that light for other people to do that work for themselves too? I have no
Yeah.
idea if they answered your question.
No, yes. And that really brings up such a amazing point because we are in such a industry where it is constantly somebody else has the answers for you. And that's why I think when you have really good coaches and you have coaches who do it really well, they're not telling you your answers. They are creating a container for you to unlock your own answers. And that's really powerful. And so whenever we step into these containers where somebody is claiming to know something that you don't know, that's when we run the other direction. And that's when it is like, it's like guru syndrome of like, this person has what I want, so I'm going to do everything they do. It's like, that's never going to work because you're not them. And so it's that really beautiful, you made a beautiful distinction on that of like, I have every answer that I could ever possibly need. And I tell all of my clients, I'm like, you don't know anything about you or I don't know anything about you. I'm not going to be able to tell you anything that you don't already know. but we're creating the space for you to tap into it, for you to believe
Mhm.
it. And then also there's that aspect that I think you have a really strong like self-trust. Like you've learned that probably a
Mm.
skill, like, especially after you found your voice, like you trust yourself. You trust that that message coming through is something that's meant for you. And a lot of people out there don't have that. A lot of people out there are like, well, let me go ask somebody if that's right. Like I was the queen of validation.
Mm.
Like I needed somebody else to tell
Same.
me that I was like,
Same.
and it's not like that anymore. Like for me, there was a hard cutoff of like, oh, I actually, this is my answer. Like this is my message. This is what I know.
Mm.
Nobody else can tell me anything else. I can step into containers to unlock
Yeah.
more answers for myself. But I know that answer.
Yes.
So what was that light switch for you? When did you go from queen of validation to queen of
Mhm.
self-trust?
It's been a long process, I will say for sure. And I think that in the last couple of years too, it's just been developing even more. I will say one of the tools that helped me build this self-trust even deeper was human design. I don't know if you've heard of human design, but
Mm-hmm.
it was just literally, I'm not even saying like there's so much to learn in human design, but just simply if that's something that's kind of intriguing you, figure out, like, find out the way that you're meant to make decisions. So I'm a sacral authority. So for me, it was like, I know that my best way to make decisions is literally yes, no. That's what I'm going to get. I'm going to get yes, no. And mine's very visceral. Like I make sounds sometimes, it's like, ooh,
Mm-hmm.
yes, absolutely. And the thing is too, is I can go back in my life before even knowing human design and knowing those moments too, and being able to be like, no, this is not for me. Like even relationships that
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't have entered. Um, but it's that has just allowed me to, because it's almost like created this like understanding, or it's affirmed it for me. Now I lean into it even more. But I think for me too, I was very much that person who was kind of like searching for the validation. And the thing is too, almost like someone who has just like this influx of ideas. And I could literally like scroll on social and be like, ooh, I could do this. And like, we're just adding more ideas to the pile. More, bring on more, bring on more. And then I create this space of like, where do I start? Well, the
Mm-hmm.
thing is all these ideas have kind of come through from just like from scrolling. And I feel like in a way, hopefully I can explain this properly, but it's almost like it's just kind of come from like out of nowhere in a way. Whereas I think what's different is when the idea lands from a very centered, quiet place. Hopefully this makes sense.
Yes.
But like,
Yes.
not necessarily that I'm one who meditates where like I will sit in silence. Like to me, I love like going for a walk and meditating. But like those ideas, when they come and they're not coming from you watching something else or scrolling and this idea comes through, not to say that those aren't good, but it's different when it comes from you. And I feel like when you've experienced one of those moments, you'll know what I mean when I say that. But when that idea really comes from you, that's where I feel like it has created this difference of like self-trust. And now I'm not necessarily like, I allow myself to kind of sit with the idea a little bit. It's not kind of like where I used to be like, all right, do the thing and get it out.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's like a little bit, I allow myself to kind of sit with it more and allow it to like percolate a little bit more. And I feel like that has allowed me to really transition from seeing like, ooh, this really is something that I can see because I've put so much more depth into it. I'm like, this is really meant for me. And this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing versus like, ooh, let's get this idea out and just like do it because I want instant validation. I
Yeah.
want it right away, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's been the difference.
Yeah, and I think that's such a beautiful way to put it because a lot of times like it kind of goes to sum up like what we've been talking about is what is your voice? So there's nothing wrong, right? Like you said about scrolling and getting inspired, but are you inspired because you want to prove that you can, or you want to
Mm.
still prove yourself in some way? Or is that inspiration coming from a place of, oh, that was the thing I needed to see to spark the
Mm.
inspiration within me. And when we
Yeah.
look at it differently and we understand the texture in the place that it's originated, and it's not coming from a place of fear or lack, or like, if I don't do this, then I'm not going to be successful like them. That, and if it's not that, if it's like, oh, this is fun, like, oh, this is,
Mm,
wow, that really populates something within me, and oh, I can feel that excitement on it, then that's another way we can hear that our voice too, because the world is always, I'm the same way with meditation. Like, the world is my meditation, is what I like to
yeah.
say. And so, like, you're going to see things and it's going to inspire. And for me, my MO was always, I can do this to show everybody else that I can do it, right? Or
Yep.
I can do it better. I can do it better than them, right? I could do that. That was where a lot of my ideas generated. And now they generate from what's in alignment, and what is it that really needs to come up? What is the real expression of who I am today, and what I
Mm,
want to put out there and what I want that to look like. And so when we really evaluate not just the idea itself, but who we are in the creation of the idea, then
yeah.
that is another way that we can really lean into that knowing and that self-trust space as well.
Mm. There's so much in that, and I also want to add too that, allowing ourselves the evolution of things, like trusting that evolution of who you are going
Yeah.
to evolve. We are ever evolving. Your self-trust, that level of self-trust, as long as you're like in this commitment of it and you commit to it, that self-trust is also going to deepen. It's allowing yourself to play in it. And I feel like what I've kind of learned, especially over the last like 10 years of kind of like building a personal brand, I've just realized that, like, for me, you got to see business as an experiment. You got to
Mhm.
let that be and bring that play into it too. It can be fun to like test things, and I feel like that allows us to kind of loosen that pressure a little bit, or not spiral into this loop of like, I failed, like I put this out, I put all this energy and effort, and like nothing happened.
Mhm.
All good information that you just learned. And also just to evaluate, like, where did this idea come from? I loved how you were kind of when you were saying the texture of the idea. I'm like, oh yes, like it feels different when like, it feels different. The excitement feels different for it, where you feel like you kind of have to should put this out, or I should do this. Like, that's
Mhm.
where the energy comes from, right? But when it's coming from this deep place of excitement, it's almost like it just comes out so naturally, and things kind of just start falling into place. Like, the trust that you have for yourself is going to build as long as you are constantly in practice with it, right? Like, constantly like, ooh, did I, how can I trust myself more today? Even
Yeah.
just being in that conversation with yourself. And that's, for me, I was just very intentional of just like go inward, and that's what build this trust. And I think it's just going to look different for everyone, but my my own level of trust is also going to continue to deepen because I'm in constant like practice and communication with that as
Yeah.
well.
And the thing too is that where I think a lot of people get held up is that self-trust doesn't mean that everything's going to work out exactly as you intended.
Yeah.
That's where it's like, people are like, well, I trusted myself and I look where I ended up, but everything's falling
Mm-hmm.
apart. It's like everything's coming together. And so it's also our
Yes.
relationship with what is happening in our life. And then we can go back and also say, but did you really trust yourself, or were you making decisions out of lack and resistance? And so
Mm-hmm.
if we just use everything that's happening in our life as that mirror and that reflection, then we can become into this different relationship with ourselves and our actions and the things that we do and don't do. And then our trust becomes easier. And if it doesn't
Yeah.
work out, it doesn't work out. And it's just another exploration, right? It's just, what did I learn from that? And what do I step into? And did I really trust myself at the very beginning of this? And that's a
Yeah.
huge thing, because people are like, well, I've trusted myself before and it got me, I mean,
Yeah.
XYZ. And it's like, yeah, but we have to evaluate again, where did the texture come from with your decision? Were you really trusting yourself, or are you trying to prove? And there's so many different things in that we oftentimes overlook. So this has been
Yeah.
an amazing conversation. I could probably talk to you for another 15 hours, but we're going to wrap it up here. You've been absolutely amazing. So I want everyone to be able to find you, follow you, engage with you. So tell us what offers you have right now and where we can find you.
So my place that I love is Instagram. So Words by Ashley Ann. And through there, you can find my own podcast, Beyond the Surface. And you can also find an upcoming creative mentorship program that I'm creating this year. So that's where you can find me if you want to also get your story out into the world. I'm the person that's going to help you do that. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. This has been amazing. And everyone, I will see you next week.